For the first sort of thing that we're going to do, which is explain why Vietnam seems to be a top performer, we're going to use some data that come from several countries, of which Vietnam is only one, and we're going to see whether or not sort of what seems to explain things in Vietnam also seems to explain in other countries. I mean, to take a really simple example, Vietnamese parents are relatively high educated, and we can see what's the effect within Vietnam of parent education, and then we can see in other countries, do we see the same effect or not? And there are many other things we can look at as well. If we see they seem to have the same effect in these data sets that are the same across multiple countries, then that could have implications for what other countries should be doing. You know, how can they get to where Vietnam is? The second one, the Escuela Nueva program, you know, Latin America is very different from Vietnam in many ways. So if this program that has been tried in several other countries seems to be successful in Vietnam, well, those being two very different countries, probably there's a good chance that it could be effective in other countries as well. So I think that could be useful. And then finally, the curriculum reform, it's hard to say right now how relevant it's going to be to other countries because it hasn't been worked out in detail, but to the extent after it does get worked out and we evaluate, if we find that it's really effective, then hopefully at least some aspects of that will be applicable to other countries. Because just like in Vietnam, I was saying that employers complain that the people they hire don't have the right skills. Well, other employers in other countries have the same complaints, even in the US and the UK and many other developed countries.
It's interesting because I think the scenario that I'm describing is actually, while it has not been, other countries have not been studied in this particular way, but is very relevant for them. So for example, when you look at low-cost private schools, India there's been work done on India which says that they are facing some of the very same issues that we are facing. When we look at constraints in the teacher labor markets or frictions that exist, I think Africa is facing teacher shortages. So I think the systems approach which addresses these frictions is very relevant for many other countries, and I think the same is about the policy response.
Because education systems actually, and this is the point that Lan Pritchard's been making for a while, that they actually look very similar across contexts, and they've looked very similar across time. So the Delhi component of our research, for example, will give us unprecedented insight, at least in the South Asian context, about what is it that happens in classrooms, what is it that teachers are doing, what is it that students are doing, what are the pedagogical strategies that are actually being used. And that should be something that is broadly informative over a fairly wide range of systems and fairly wide range of schools. And we think that that kind of detailed insight would be very valuable.
There's sort of two aspects I think that are interesting. So the one aspect is that unlike previous evaluations of specific programs, we are evaluating government policies that have run at scale. So knowing what works at that kind of national scale level is a very different set of questions we'll be answering. And this is potentially the first time that a developing country really wants to emphasize sort of focusing on learning outcomes and to trying to understand what happens when the whole education sort of shifts towards learning outcomes. Secondly, in order to understand the sort of process that led towards this reform, the political economy behind it, what we can learn is not only the policies at work, but the processes that could lead or inhibit eventual change in policies.